Species. Unite.
Species. Unite.
I also heard the sounds of killer whales. They were calling to each other loud and clear. These melodious whistles and calls, which went right into my earpieces. I realized that even if I couldn't see them, they were there somewhere beneath me in the ocean. They were communicating with each other. They were staying in contact. It was like a big family.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you like today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. A few weeks ago, the Miami Seaquarium announced that it had entered into a contract with the nonprofit group Friends of Lolita, aka Friends of Toki, to transport Lolita the orca to an ocean sanctuary. Lolita, whose real name is Tokate, is a 57-year-old orca who has been kept in captivity in this tiny whale-sized swimming pool at Miami Seaquarium for the past 50 years. It is absolutely enormous that she's being released. This never happens. It's happening in part because of decades worth of pressure from animal rights groups, and in part because of Colt's owner and now animal rights hero, Jim Irsay, who's funding this. So because we're celebrating orcas and because we're celebrating Tokate, this conversation is with Hanne Strager. Hanne is a biologist, a whale researcher, an author, and the co-founder of Andins Whale Center in Norway. She's written many books. Her most recent, The Killer Whale Journals, was released earlier this month. It's a compilation about killer whales in Hanne's life and killer whales throughout history. And it's extraordinary. Welcome, Hanne. It's an honor to have you here, so thank you.
I'm incredibly pleased to be there.
I learned an incredible amount from your book about whales in the wild, and not only about how they live and what we do know and how much we don't know, but a lot of what I've learned was kind of the history of how we've treated them, which I had a very vague understanding of it. You start your book in the 80s when you knew nothing. Will you tell the story how it all began?
I was a young biology student, and one day I ended up in a line in a cafeteria at the university, and there was this very tall guy standing in front of me. And I think probably because he was so tall, I kind of knew who he was, and I knew he was involved with something about whales. So I started chatting with him, and it turned out that he was leaving a week later to join a small expedition on a rebuilt fishing vessel in Norway. And I was just so envious. That was what I wanted to do. And it just burst out of me if I could come. And he was really nice. And he said he thought they were maybe still looking for somebody to cook on the boat. The same day, I called the skipper of the boat, and he was Swedish. And he basically asked me 2 questions. He asked me if I could cook, and I said yes. And I really couldn't cook very much. And he asked me if I got seasick, and I said no. And I didn't really know. That turned out to be true. I didn't get seasick, but I didn't know when I started. A few days later, I just left the university and started my travel to join this expedition some 2,000 kilometers to the north.
Did you know at the time, like, what you were getting into, what was going on with whales? Like, were you studying whales at all?
No, actually, I think if this had not happened, I would have become a botanist, and probably a happy botanist. I was interested in botany, mainly because the teachers in the botany departments were quite good. So that had kind of pulled me over there. But I was looking for not just adventure, but also something that was more, surrounded by wilderness out there, something that felt more spectacular than just maybe looking at plants, actually. But I know that if you get into it, plants are also really cool. But I was looking for something more. So no, it was all coincidence. And I had no knowledge of whales and not more than anybody else, at least. And I was not very aware of what was going on in Norway at the time, because the expedition went to Norway, which was actually, it turned out to be quite a controversial place to be because of whaling issues.
And there was a lot of whale hatred, right, at the time.
Yeah, there was specifically a hatred towards killer whales, and I call them killer whales and not orcas, and I apologize if anyone is offended by that, but that's simply just a habit. Yes, there was some hatred, and they had been persecuted until quite recently when I joined this expedition, simply because they ate herring. And the fishermen didn't like killer whales. And most people were, these were fishing communities, so people didn't like them and they feared them. And they thought that the killer whales were responsible for the colossal collapse that had been in the herring fishery some years earlier. So the killer whales took a lot of blame for that. When we came and said, well, we're looking to find killer whales and we think they're interesting and we're biologists, they thought we were, at the least they thought we were crazy. And they also thought that we were probably some covert Greenpeace organization trying to infiltrate what was going on and stop whaling in Norway, because Norwegians were still whaling. They still are, actually, for the small species of baleen whale that's called the minke whale. So pretty much everybody who came from the outside and were positive towards whales, they must have been some kind of Greenpeace arrangement. So we were battling both the attitude that people had to killer whales and also a little bit the attitude they had to us. They were a little bit suspicious, and a lot of them were also very nice. Often a fisherman would come up to me because they found out that I was cooking on the vessel, and they would give me like a bucket full of herring. That's like maybe 50 fish, a lot of them. So you can have these. So they were also nice and kind. But if we're discussing killer whales with them, their attitude was that, nah, they shouldn't really be here.
And your very first day that you were there, you saw whales.
Yeah, I arrived a little bit groggy from a long train drive through Sweden, and then the bus ride, and then I found the boat in the harbor, and they were getting ready to jump into small zodiacs and zoom out because they've heard from a fisherman that there were killer whales out there. And the skipper asked if I wanted to join. Of course, yeah, that's what I came for. So I jumped into this little zodiac, and I was not really dressed for it, I found out, because the waves were quite big, so I got wet right away. And I had no idea what to expect. I was partly a little bit nervous about just being in a small zodiac. I've never been that before. And about doing things right or wrong. And also, of course, about meeting 8-9 meter long killer whales. They're huge. And the boat was small. So what would happen? And we're looking for them. And we kind of focused on a small island. There were some gulls in front of it. And I think they were driving towards that island because they thought that the killer whales might be under the gulls. But it actually turned out that the killer whales came up right behind us instead. And they came very close. It was both thrilling and fantastic. And I also found out that in the moment I was not at all scared, because the behavior of the animals were not scary. They were obviously a little bit curious about us, But other than that, they were just continuing on what they were doing. So it didn't feel scary. And of course, it was incredible and thrilling and fantastic. I was hooked. And I had another experience some days later. Because I was cooking, I didn't go out as much as some of the other people on the boat. And one day, the guy from the cafeteria, his name was Morten, came back because they'd forgotten something and said, well, there are killer whales out there. You should come now. And I hurried to follow him. I went into this little Zodiac and we went out. And it was just me and him in this little boat. When we got out there, the killer whales had gone. They were no longer there. And there was these gray, low-hanging clouds, and it was a little bit rainy, not very windy. We were looking around to see if we could find them again, but they were kind of gone. And then Morten pulled out a hydrophone from a bag on the boat and started lowering it into the water. And he gave me the headphones to listen. And I had never experienced anything like that at all, and I was unprepared because I heard some low drumming noises, which I later learned were the engine from faraway boats, which is everywhere in the ocean, no matter where you listen. But I also heard the sounds of killer whales. They were calling to each other loud and clear, these melodious whistles and calls, which went right into my earpieces. I realized that even if I couldn't see them, they were there somewhere beneath me in the ocean. They were communicating with each other. They were staying in contact. It was like a big family. They were calling out for each other. It must have been completely dark where they were, because once you get 10 meters below the surface, it's really dark. And still, they don't need vision to stay in contact. They can just call out for each other. It was a revelation for me. And it was also incredibly beautiful to sit there in the grisly weather and just listen to all these sounds. And that was like a turning point in my life, because that's pretty much where I decided that that's what I'll do. I'll start studying killer whales instead of botany.
And at the time, not many people, that wasn't really a thing yet in Norway. People weren't studying them. There wasn't a lot of information.
No, they were not. There was one professor at the university who has done a few papers, which was mainly about how many there were and how many they have killed in the culling programs they had from 1930 until 1982, when they gained protection. And that was pretty much it. Very, very little was known. So when we started these studies, I was not the only one. There was a Finnish woman called Tiu Simila who was also studying them, and a few others joined in. It was hard actually for us to get respect at the universities. It took a long time before it became something that the scientific environment in Norway thought was interesting. Eventually it happened, but it took a few decades before it became something that was comparable to what you know in other countries where killer whales are studied very much. So at that time, they didn't know where they were. They didn't know if they had stable family groups. They didn't know if they knew they ate herring, but there were also rumors that sometimes they took seals, or they took even bigger marine mammals like whales. And nobody knew if it was the same animals that just switched diet, or if it was something that they were specialized on. And nobody knew how many there were, or how they moved, how they migrated. So everything was blank.
How did these studies happen, even in terms of counting them? Talk about how that happens.
We had incredible help from people in Canada and the US who mentored us. Tiu, who was the doctoral student on the whole population thing, she received help from Mike Big and John Ford in Canada and Ken Balcom. And I received a lot of help from John Ford, who did studies on dialects in Norway, because my studies focused on their vocalizations and their calls. And I wanted to find out if they have dialects, as was known from the Canadian waters that killer whales have. So I wanted to see if that was also true in Norway, if it was something that you can begin to understand as a characteristic of the species. And it turned out that, yes, Norwegian killer whale groups are just as stable as they are in Canada and the US. They have very stable family groups. They're very specialized on what they eat. So most of them were herring specialists. A few have turned out to be specialized on seals. And I also found out that they have dialects, just as we know from the Canadian and the US killer whales. We had a lot of help on how to do this. We ran into something that was like an obstacle, but not something we could do anything about. And that is that there were simply a lot more killer whales in Norway than in the US and Canadian waters, which made it a lot more difficult to find out who is swimming with who and who is in family and who are related, just because sometimes there could be 500 whales in the fjord, and then it gets really difficult. And also they tend to come in mainly in the wintertime, so the days are very short and it's very cold. So that's also a thing that made it a little bit more difficult than if you can study them in the summertime and you can wear a t-shirt. We have to dress up in survival suits and hats and mittens and everything just to be out there.
Talk about the dialects a little bit. Like, can you understand, like, oh, this whale is from this pod because he sounds this way? How does that go?
Generally speaking, that's how it works. They have different repertoires of calls. So a group that we know, if we make a good recording of their calls, we'll get maybe between 10 and 15 calls that we say they are characteristic of this group. So they have these very specific calls that are used in this group. And some of these calls are maybe shared with another group, but not all of them. Usually it works the way that each group have their own repertoire, which is specific. And the more they share with another group, the more it's believed that they are also related genetically to that group. So they have a lot of the same calls in both groups. So I feel very confident saying, yes, they do have dialects, and they have these group-specific repertoires of calls that we also know from killer whales elsewhere in the world. And that, of course, is incredibly cool. We didn't get call repertoires for all the groups, and we didn't get to know all the groups, simply because there are so many. So it's a little bit, we can't say for sure if it's the same completely, because we don't know all the groups. And also, we started studying them in the late 80s and in the 90s, and the hunting of killer whales in Norway ended in 82. So what we encountered were a lot of family groups that have been split and where many members have been taken out. So it was you could call it an unstable society of groups there, where my guess is that some of them have had a lot of their members taken out by hunting, by whaling. And now, because they've been protected since 82, it's estimated that there are more than 3,000 killer whales in Norwegian waters. So nobody knows now all the groups and all the group members, simply because there are so many.
Spending so much time with them, were you able to understand like how they interacted as families and as groups, where it makes it easier for humans to get on their side, right? Where we say, oh, they're really a family. Oh, they stay with their mom and their aunts forever. Those kind of things. Were you seeing that kind of stuff like up close and personal?
We saw a lot of interesting behavior, but I'm sure there's still a lot to learn. because we only see them at the surface. And we see very little. Of course, we also sometimes film them underwater, and we still do that. And that gives us a new glimpse into their world. But I don't think we have learned a lot yet, because I think they have so complicated and so interesting behavior that there's a lot to be learned. But we saw many examples of what I would call strong family-related behavior. Like we would see one female at the surface with 5 or 6 young ones joining her. Surely one female doesn't have 5 calves. No, that's what we call babysitting or kindergarten. It's when the others go hunting, one will stay at the surface with the small ones. And that's something that we see quite often. And that could also be an adult male that would stay at the surface with the young ones. Another thing that we saw very often is how they circle herring to fish, which is also a learned behavior and something that's typical. And for the Norwegian whales, is that it's a complicated dance they do, where they surround the herring school, they swim around it, they dive down, they turn their white bellies towards the herring, probably to scare them into a tighter and tighter ball. They blow bubbles underwater to get the herring to get closer and closer and closer to the surface of the water and scare them. And all members of the group take part in this behavior of corralling the herring. And then only when the school is really tight will they start to move in on it. And then they didn't eat them right away, or they didn't swim in with open mouth. They turn around and slap the herring with their tail, so that the herring either dies or is stunned from the slap, and then they pick them up, probably because the herring is too fast for them to catch unless they can make them motionless.
Wow.
And of course, we saw a lot of behavior where females take care of their youngs, and even some really sad examples where a young calf has died and the mother will be carrying it around for a while, or swimming with it in its mouth. So there are lots of behaviors that we have witnessed that testifies just how strong their family bonds are, and how much they work as a family, and how much they depend on each other.
You have a chapter about Iceland, and I never knew this. In the 50s, the U.S. military helped Iceland by coming in and just mass warfare on killer whales. They killed tons of them because Iceland thought they were interfering with the fishing. You say in that chapter, we don't even know what that did to these families. The aftermath of who survives that is almost as equally devastating as the actual mass killing. Will you talk about that a little? Do we know anything after something like that?
What happened was that the fishery, and this is the same kind of killer whales that we have in Norway. So they are herring specialists. They eat herring. And in the 1950s in Iceland, suddenly the fishermen started to complain that they were having problems with the killer whales. And the killer whales were swimming through their nets, which were drift nets for herring, and they were just not only destroying the catch, but they were also destroying the nets. So it's kind of understandable that the fishermen were very frustrated. And I think Iceland in the 1950s was very poor. So this was probably very poor fishermen. And I think we must understand that this was their livelihood, and it was being wrecked and destroyed in front of them. And they were really frustrated. They had no idea what to do with it. Eventually, they talked to the Ministry of Fisheries, and the government spoke to the U.S. Air Base, which was at that time positioned in Keflavik, right outside Reykjavik. And the U.S. Army, they really stepped up and said, sure, we can help you. And I think there was also political motives for this, because they wanted to make sure that they were liked and appreciated in Iceland. The first time they went out, they sent 79 gunmen out on boats to kill killer whales with machine guns. But that wasn't enough. So the year after, they sent up bombing planes and they dropped depth charges right in the group of killer whales. And then they followed up by shooting at the fleeing group of killer whales with machine guns from air. This continued for 3 years where they did this. And then eventually the problem disappeared. And I think it disappeared because the herring fishermen started using nylon nets, which couldn't be destroyed by the killer whales. And they also used a different catch method with purse seine nets instead of drift nets. So luckily, the problem was resolved one way or another. But yes, I think that we often focus on how bad it is that they're killed. And I think that is absolutely horrible. And nobody knows how many were killed. But for an animal where family relations are so crucial, so important, a highly intelligent animal where the ties between family members is so incredibly strong. They last a lifetime. I mean, if you are born into a killer whale group, you stay there. You have a relationship not just with your mother, but you have it with your sisters. You have it with your grandmother. You have it with your uncles. Everybody is related and everybody is one tight group. So I think it must have been devastating for these groups to lose some of their family members in this way. And I think also they are intelligent enough to realize that it was a dramatic and traumatic way of losing a family member. So it's sometimes I'm astonished that killer whales show up alongside boats and don't have any grievances, that they are happy to meet people. I don't know, maybe they can distinguish who were bad for them and who were not. At least Norwegian whalers who hunted killer whales until 1982 say that if they killed a killer whale, they couldn't approach the same group for a long time after that. So killer whales, they learn and they know what is bad for them.
When you were there, when you were young and studying there, they let you and your group approach because you were in the small boats, right? And they knew that wasn't dangerous?
Yeah, no, we never experienced anything that felt like a threat or aggressive in any way. And I still never have. I mean, this is decades now, and I've still never had an encounter with a killer whale where I've thought, oh, what was going on there? That was not nice. It's always just been calm and nice. Right. Which is actually quite incredible that they are just so superior and they know it, so they don't have to feel threatened by a boat unless it's somebody carrying a gun.
One more story I want to talk about before I go bigger picture is the whales in Twofold Bay in Australia, the story you tell about them, because it's astonishing, how they worked with the fishermen and worked in community for generations.
I think that story is one of my favorites because it's incredibly interesting, and it went on for 100 years. So it started with European whalers coming to Australia, finding out that there was some kind of collaboration between Aboriginals in Australia and whales. And there was specifically one whaling company that employed Aboriginals and learned from them, that worked with the killer whales instead of against it. In most other places, killer whales have been the enemies of whalers because they go in and take parts of the whales that the whalers want. So most whalers kill them or try to. But these whalers in Twofold Bay, which is south of Sydney in Australia, they saw the killer whales as their helpers. These whalers wanted the big whales. They wanted the white whales and the humpback whales and occasionally a fin whale or a blue whale. And they had help from killer whales in catching them. And this was a skill they learned from the Aboriginals, who probably since going long time back had somehow benefited from killer whales driving a whale on shore and making it available for Aboriginals to eat. So they learned if they worked with the killer whales, we can sometimes get some extra food this way. And what happened was that these killer whales will eventually, the way it developed was that they would discover now they're big whales outside the bay, and they would swim to the whaling station, which was inside the bay, and they would slap their tails on the surface of the water to alert the whalers that something is going on. And the whalers knew then to follow the killer whales. So they went into this was rowing boats. This was in the middle of the 1840s and 50s it started. So they would go into the rowing boats and they would be led by the killer whales to where the big whales were. And when they got there, the killer whales would help the whalers catch them. They would bite the big whales' tails, their flippers. They would fling themselves on top of the big whales to block their blowholes. They would harass them to lower their speed. And eventually the whalers, with the help of the killer whales, would kill the big baleen whales, usually just one at a time. Then the whalers had learned from the Aboriginals to leave it to the killer whales. And it was called the law of the tongue, because mainly the killer whales were interested in eating the tongue of the humpback whale or right whale, and sometimes also the side of the mouth, or what is called the lips. And the whalers didn't care about that, because they were not interested in those parts. They were interested in the blubber. Whaling at that time was only for oil. And they would just put a buoy on the whale, leave it for the killer whales, and after a few days, the dead whale would have been eaten, the tongue would have been eaten, it would float up, it would gas up, would float to the surface, and the whalers would row out and pull the whale back to the shore, where it would be cut up and they would boil the blubber. And so this continued through 3 generations of whalers and as many generations of killer whales. And the whalers knew the killer whales. They knew them by name. They, just as killer whale researchers can tell killer whales apart by photo IDing them, looking for scars and nicks and different colorations of the saddle patch. These whalers, long before researchers, knew how to ID whales, and they knew them. And there's even a small catalog that's been made of the different whales. And there was quite a few photographs taken at the time from 19 until 1920 of some of these killer whales. And it's very easy to see that they're different. So I believe totally that, of course, the whalers could tell them apart. Right. And it's often said that it's astonishing that the whalers were not afraid of the killer whales. They weren't. They totally saw them as their sheepdogs that helped herd the whales so that they could catch them. But I actually think that it's just as astonishing that the killer whales were not afraid of the whalers. After all, they saw the whalers kill large whales. But in a way, I think it testifies to just how smart they are, that they had figured out that they're not after us. We can get, all of us can get something out of this collaboration. And it's one of the few collaborations that I have ever heard of which doesn't depend on training and taming an animal, a wild animal, and feeding it. There's food involved in it, but it's something that grew out more natural than just taming and feeding. And the killer whales pulled in new part members into the business, and so did the family who had the whaling station. So it is a totally incredible example of a collaboration between animal and man. And actually these whalers in Twofold Bay in Australia, they filed the first attempt to have killer whales protected. They wanted them protected. They thought they were so useful and so incredible that they should gain full protection. It's the only example I have heard of whalers arguing for protection of a whale species. And they didn't get it, which is very unfortunate, because then the killer whales actually died out.
We're not whaling so much anymore, except in a few countries. And there's not a lot of whales in captivity outside of Russia and China. I mean, we have them everywhere, but we're stopping it most places. What I didn't realize in your book, I knew the story about the whale jail in Russia, but I didn't realize how big that success was and how much power people really had to change. Will you talk about that a little bit?
In 2019, I went to Kamchatka in Far East Russia to work with some killer whale researchers there. And I wanted to work with them and to understand what killer whales are in Russia and how they work and spend time with them. But I also wanted to learn more about the whale jail. The whale jail, as some of you probably know, was the live capture of more than 100 whales. Most of them, I think more than 90 of them, were beluga whales, but 12 of them were killer whales. The idea, of course, was for all these whales to be sold on to probably most of them to China, where there are many marine parks, and many more are opening all the time. And there's a huge demand for big charismatic animals like belugas and especially killer whales. So even though the different companies who caught them never said directly where they were meant to go, this is what is generally believed, that they were meant to go to China. And they were kept in a facility south of Kamchatka, which was labeled the whale jail. And I spoke to the Russian journalist who filmed this for the first time. It's a young woman. Unfortunately, she died just a few months after I spoke to her from an accident with a snow scooter. But the story she told me was that she had heard about this place. She went down there. She was flying a drone. She couldn't get near the facility. There were fences all around it, and there were people with arms guarding it. So it wasn't a place you could get into. It was at the coast, and the enclosures were in seawater. The seawater at that time was frozen solid. It was really, really cold. But in the facility, there were some outside pools and some indoor pools. And the indoor pools were not in a building. They were just under some tarps. But she couldn't see them from the air. When she flew the drone, you could see all these small circles with beluga whales in, except they are so tiny, it looks like tadpoles in a petri dish. And there are hundreds of them, and it's horrifying. And it's also horrifying to think that how hard it was for them to actually get enough food in those conditions. Of course, they were fed by the people who had them because they were money worth, but it really was very, very, very cold. And the people who had the facility had to clear their small enclosures for ice all the time so that they could get up and breathe. And inside, where the killer whales were, maybe the conditions were a little bit better, but killer whales are actually not built to be in icy water for so long time. So this was really bad. And what was really new to me and interesting was that the local environmental groups, local NGOs, were filing court cases against the people who had, or the companies who had captured all these whales. And these NGOs were incredibly effective and really, really well prepared. So when they met up in court, they actually won all the cases. So in the end, because of the work of these NGOs, because of their really very, very good lawyers, they won the cases, and eventually the whales had to be released. It's always a discussion how much pressure from the outside means here, because there was a lot of publicity about it. There was a lot of international pressure as well. And everybody from Cousteau to Jane Goodall signed petitions and said, release the whales. And when I spoke to my Russian colleagues, they very proudly said, no, we could have done this without international help. This was the NGOs who did the work. And I have a feeling that international pressure was probably really helpful, that it also helped.
But when that happened, when they said, no, you have to release them all, they also said, we're doing a ban on catching captive whales until 2023, which is now. Was that enforced?
To my knowledge, there has not been any captures since, but the ban was until 2023. So what's interesting is, of course, what is happening now. And as we all know, the situation is completely different. I cannot go to Russia anymore, and it's a very, very different situation. I think international pressure on Russia in this matter is probably not going to make any difference anymore. There's a reason to be concerned for sure.
And so we don't know. And we don't know with China. I mean, there's no stopping anything right now in terms of this being a growing industry instead of a shrinking one like it is in most parts of the world.
I think what we can hope is that the change that we have seen in other places that have marine parks with, for instance, killer whales or other very large marine mammals, have met with the public's resistance. The audience, a lot of the audience do not want this anymore. And we can only hope that there will be some kind of a awakening also in China, where people there say, no, we don't think this is a good way of demonstrating how interesting and fascinating killer whales are.
So now when you look at whales in the wild, killer whales in the wild, they're not really being hunted very much anymore, right? We're still their biggest threat, though, in terms of environment.
Yeah, we see, if we look at that, I think there are two or three big threats. One is lack of availability of food. And I know for the killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, at least the southern residents, which are the ones that are mainly in US waters, they're getting smaller and they are dying. And a lot of people believe that food availability is the issue, that there's simply that the commercial and also the leisure fishery for salmon is too big. And if you left the salmon alone, there would be enough for the killer whales. So competition with the fishery, I think, is a big, big issue in some places. It was an issue in Russia. So the killer whales there were mainly feeding on something called Atka mackerel, and then that was overfished, and they switched to salmon, which is now being overfished. So I think overfishing of the important food resource is a huge issue for local populations of killer whales in the US waters, in Russia also. Another thing also has to do with human activities, or they all have, and that is just traffic and noise and interactions with boats. In Norway, because the herring fishery is now very healthy and there's a lot of killer whales around, the killer whales are very, very, very interested in herring boats, because they learn that every time a herring boat is taking in the catch, there's a spill in the water, which is easy for them to grab. So every time a herring boat starts there, it's called a pump, that they actually pump up the herring from the purse seine net. The killer whales, they come from sometimes 6-8 miles away. They hear the pump, they go. Easy picking here. But what happens then is that sometimes they get entangled in nets or get inside the purse seine net. So the risk of killer whales drowning in nets or getting tangled in nets is quite big, actually, and it is happening on more and more. So that's one risk. Noise pollution is a huge risk. And general pollution with organic pollutants is an enormous problem. Very, very different from population to population. So the killer whales in Norway are probably the least affected. They also eat herring, which is quite low in the food chain. But for marine mammal eating killer whales, which eat high up in the food chain and where there's an accumulation of all kinds of pollutants, they have extremely high level of some very toxic substances. And that means that their breeding success is low, and their immune system is probably in trouble. So there's enough of problems if you look at it, even without hunting.
Where do you see hope, for the future?
I see only one hope, and that's increased awareness. That is that more of us are aware of what's going on, and more of us care about what's going on. That is the only hope there is for us to care about the ocean, not just killer whales, but the ocean in general, the fish, the plankton, everything that's in it, the seabirds. And to care about it is not just to love it, but to actually start to take action and make some choices. And if you ask me, choices is not so much about not using a plastic straw, but be careful who you vote for. That's ultimately the only thing that will change things, is if those who are in charge are people that we trust will actually make a difference when it comes to the ocean.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, for your book, for your work in telling their stories. I mean, that is how change happens, is when we connect and understand and fall in love, which is exactly what your book did for me.
I'm so thrilled you like it.
I loved it. To learn more about Hanne and to read the killer whale journals, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and you could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast, we would greatly appreciate it. Go to our website, speciesunite.com, and click donate. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke, Ayana Peoples, and Anna Callner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.